Hello, and welcome to Palisade Corporation's webcast, Good Practices and Common Mistakes, presented by Hubert, Groen, and Dahl of Epix Analytics. My name is Jameson Romeo Hall, and I will be your host today, and I'll be available to help answer WebEx technical questions by chat. If you experience technical difficulties joining this WebEx session, please dial 1-866-229-3239. At this time, all attendees are in a listen-only mode. Please note that as an attendee, you are part of a larger audience today. The attendee list is suppressed to maintain attendee privacy. We will be holding a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's presentation. You may ask an online question anytime throughout the presentation today by clicking on the chat icon located on the floating toolbar. I would also encourage you to visit our website and sign up for a free trial download of our software, including our lead products, At Risk, and the Decision Tools Suite. We invite you to sit back and relax and enjoy today's presentation. Hubert, you have the presenter ball.
Thank you, Jameson. It sounds like we're going to have a flight somewhere because we're going to sit back and relax. Thank you, Jameson, for the nice introduction, and thank you all for attending this webcast. Appreciate everyone's attendees here. So for the next 45 minutes or so, I'd hope to take you all, I guess, on a journey to keep with the same theme and talk about good practices and common mistakes in the area of risk analysis and the use of Monte Carlo and At Risk. Just to give you a quick, brief overview of the presentations before we go into it. So the first, it's not even a 1/3, but the first 10 minutes or so, I'll give you a brief background on where some of the applications that these common mistakes and good practices come from. I'll keep that very brief because, of course, the focus is here on the second part, the common mistakes, and the third part, the good practices. So just to give you, I guess, a brief, not a warning, but so the common practices, you'll find that they're going to be a little bit more technical. So we're going to actually talk and look at risk and see a little bit more technical aspects there as well. Then the second part, the good practices, is a little less technical, and it also deals more with how do we actually use this and how do we make management understand what we have actually done. And then finally, as Jameson said, there's a Q&A session at the end. It's going to be full seminar, so in other words, we're going to have quite a bit to talk about, so let's get started. And now I actually have to find how to share my desktop here, and we practiced it, so it should not be hard.
Go up to that Quick Start tab that you see.
Oh yeah, right.
Oh yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Great. So I am assuming here that everyone can see my desktop.
Looks good.
Great. All right. So a brief background, just that everyone understands where I'm coming from and where all these practical common mistakes and good practices come from. So Epix Analytics is a specialized risk analysis consulting firm. We basically, in a nutshell, we help people employ tools like At Risk, anywhere from where do I even get started to how do we make sure that if we have a big portfolio optimization, we can use the results as well as possible for management. Our focus is really on quantitative risk analysis and modeling, and at the end of the day, and I'll come back to this quite a few times, at the end of the day, all we do is really care about improving decision making. And that will come back when we talk about good practices, because that actually, and this is true for probably all of you here on this call, at the end of the day, what we care about is how do we improve and how do we give insight to decision makers about risk and uncertainty. And so it's something that really is important when we even get into very technical details about that risk. As a consultancy, we do consultancy. We actually do quite a bit of training, and then we also do research projects. And that is in a wide range of fields. We'll list it here a few. You see here actually a picture of my colleague and myself here, we're doing a mining project where we forecasted the output of a large open pit copper mine somewhere in the U.S. here, where there's a lot of uncertainty about these trucks. You know, they can have all these unscheduled outs and scheduled outs. There's uncertainty about the you know, how fast these trucks drive, the crushers, all of that can have risk and uncertainty related to it, and the company was really interested in understanding how much production they could have in the next week or a month, or actually all the way up to a year. We also do some work in the financial area, not necessarily always kind of Wall Street stuff, but also a lot related to, you know, investments that companies make. Maybe it's a merger or acquisition, or maybe it's some business development kind of work. And then finally, we do quite a bit of work in the pharmaceutical industry. So just to give you a bit more applications, I guess, and I'll keep this again very brief, this first part. What we're going to talk about in this presentation is about good practice and common mistakes. I will try and keep it as generic as I can. At the same time, I'd love to, and I will certainly go into some of these specific example applications. Now you can see here on this fast list that I would certainly not be able to go through every single application and say, and this is how it applies to you if you're working in, you know, for example, inventory optimization, or if you're working in pharmacoeconomics. But I hope that by giving you some of these practical applications that you'll see in a bit, that you will find for yourself and recognize where may I or my colleagues have made a mistake, and therefore can learn something from the presentation, of course. So enough about that. I'm sure that I get very popular if I give something for free. So what you'll actually see here is that on our website we have something called Model Assist for At Risk. And the reason I'm bringing this mostly up is because in the 3 good practices and 3 common mistakes that I'll talk about, there's so much to cover that I can't go into every detail. So what you will find is, if you look here at this M code, the MXXXX, throughout the presentation you'll see codes like M1385, for example. What that refers to is a code that you're able to type into Model Assist, this free tool that we have developed over the years, and find then more information about that specific subject. So for example, we look here at the M0407, and let me actually show you very quickly how that looks like. So this is this tool that I talked about. It's called Model Assist for At Risk, specifically for at-risk users. And here we, for example, type in that code, so M0406. And we press enter, and I typed in, not zeros, but I typed in an O. So here you, for example, get, I think I typed in the wrong subject here, but here you can see more about second-order cumulative plots. Or as you can look here in the context, you actually see 500 different subjects about anywhere between Monte Carlo simulation, you know, what distribution do I use, all the way to, you know, over 100 example models. All right, enough said about that. What I wanted to really point out here is that you will find in the presentation all these different codes, and you can use that to find out more about specific examples. All right, there we go. Now you're an at-risk user. What I'm going to assume here a little bit in this presentation is that at least you have a little bit of an understanding of what at-risk does. You understand a little bit of what Monte Carlo is. It'd be hard to do 45 minutes and all these good practices without having a little bit understanding, especially for the common mistakes. So the good practices, you can actually follow those as well if you haven't never opened at-risk. But so you may have at-risk, you may have bought it, or you may are thinking about it, and you've had some experience with Monte Carlo mainly in the past, and you're wondering what's important, how should I even start, what should I focus on, and do I maybe make mistakes? So this presentation is trying to share those good practices and common mistakes, and of course the main point here is how to prevent them. One quick question or one quick comment before we dive into what you see here, the common mistakes and the good practices, is that after this webinar, we will share the full presentation as well as all the example models that are talked about in this presentation. So in other words, you're certainly welcome to write different notes, but you will get all of that information, and you'll see that some of these example models, I may go through them a little bit too quick, and you will actually be able to get the full example model and apply it into your own models, of course. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? So the first part of the main part of the presentation is these common mistakes, and we have 3 that we identified. The first one is the most technical one. After that, it gets all, I guess, less technical. So multiply your efforts when multiplying. Sounds kind of cryptic, but we're talking about when you're multiplying distributions. Be careful, and what we say is multiply your effort. So we're going to see what is a very common mistake there with multiplying distributions, and then several ways of preventing that. And we'll actually, we'll not just focus on, the specific technique to use, of course, but we're also focusing, first of all, on getting your intuition so that you understand why this is wrong. The second part is the software is not a substitute for critical thinking. That sounds very logical. That sounds very, everyone is going to agree, I'm sure. But you'll see that when we put that actually into specific examples, you'll probably get it. Value your relationship. This has all to do with correlations, and we're going to talk about those as well. So that's the first part. Then we go into good practices. We have to start off with start your model or start your effort with a blueprint. And we'll talk about what I mean with the blueprint and why you should consider doing that. And in some cases, it's probably not worth the effort. But in general, it's a very good practice. Check your model. Again, sounds very logical. Everyone is going to agree right now. But we'll actually look at some practical ways of doing this. And then finally, educate and engage your executive. And we're going to talk about some examples. We're going to talk about some good practices around that. All right, so there we go. Hold on. We are going to take off for I guess, somewhere in the world in our plane. All right, so multiply your efforts when multiplying. So what is the mistake? So let's put it first into somewhat cryptic or more technical language. When we use probability distributions, and you'll see 2 examples, for example, here on the sheet, what's the mistake is if we are using them as if they were fixed numbers. So in other words, for example, we all in high school probably, or well before high school, learned that 2 times 3 is 6. Well, when we now have a 2 that isn't so sure, and a 3 that isn't so sure, in other words, they both have distributions related to them, we certainly can't do that. Now that may sound to you, some of you, as a surprise, but let's actually go through an example here. So a very simple example. We try to really dumb it down, but then after this slide, you'll see some examples here. So let's say that for the moment you are a banker, and what you're doing is you're giving out loans to businesses or individuals. And your question is, over the next year, how much interest revenue will we get from these loans? All right, so in this simple example, we're going to assume that the interest rate itself is certain. So we're not going to vary that. But what we are varying is, or what we don't know for sure yet, is how many loans are we going to give out. And so that's kind of representative of this distribution here. This is what you call a discrete distribution, and you see that because it has discrete values, right? So maybe we'll give out 25 loans, maybe it's 15 loans, and maybe it's all the way to 45 loans. So that's how many loans do we give out. And then the second one is every client or every business or individual we're going to give out a loan to, that loan can be a different size. So some businesses may want a loan of $5,000 or euros, and another business may want 50,000. So also that we can now represent as a distribution. All right, so I think everyone is so far following this, hopefully. So what's now the mistake here is that we think of this as, well, we just multiply how many loans we will get, and we have a distribution, and we multiply that by the size of the loan. And then you should get how much in total you're going to borrow or lend to individuals or businesses. And that is wrong. Let's get some intuition to that. Why is that wrong? I've given this seminar several times also as well in a live setting, and I'll ask people what's wrong. But let me kind of go through that as a kind of an example here. So what's wrong with that is that, let's say that in a certain iteration, in one of those 1,000 or 10,000 iterations you're going to run, you may pick out, for example, a 30, right? So let's take one iteration. In that iteration, we take 30 loans we're going to extend to businesses next year. Now we're going to actually also take one sample, right, because that's that one cell that we multiply one cell with another cell, right, where we say, well, in that instance, we may extend $7,000 loan to the businesses. In that case, we would be multiplying the 30 times the 7,000 as kind of how much we are going to borrow, which would assume and would kind of the underlying thinking here is that every of those 30 businesses would exactly get $7,000. Well, even though you're not a banker, I'm sure you can understand that that's never going to be the case, right? Some businesses are going to borrow a lot, and some are borrowing a little, right? So if we have a little Excel model, and we're going to show a model in just a second, but if we have a little Excel model with at risk attached to it or in it, and we have one cell that says how many loans we're going to give, and another cell with how big is the size of that loan, and we're just multiplying those together, we basically assume that every business or every individual is going to get the same loan. And I don't need to tell you that's not the case. I just did, I guess. So here is where, and I put it here in a big box, this illustrates the mistake. So let's actually look at this in an Excel and an at-risk environment. So here is where we have, the same screenshot. You can see that hopefully. So here is where we have how much money is borrowed by a client. And what we use for it in this case is a log normal distribution. In this case, we said a mean of 10,000. So, what is the average loan? And then a standard deviation of 4,000. So that's our cell where we say how much money is going to be borrowed. The number of clients, well, in our little example in PowerPoint, it was around 30. Here we upped the number to somewhere between 400 and 800. And so here's that cell that basically, if I press the F9 and do different numbers, right, you see different numbers come up. We assumed the interest rate. This is an old model, I guess. It's not 7% right now, but we assumed that to be 7%. And here's where we see the mistake happening, right? We multiply those three things together, just like we learned in high school about fixed numbers, and we make a big mistake. So I guess I've established right now, hopefully everyone can follow that this is a mistake and kind of the intuition about it. So how do we do this correct? How do we do this correct in a way where we basically don't assume that every loan, every amount of money borrowed by a client is the same? They're different, right? The client number one is a different size than client number two, etc. So here is where you see the correct model. And in fact, and this is where you can see that I'm going to share this model with everyone after this call. You'll also see here in the PowerPoint that actually did a bit of a screenshot of that as well. So you'll have some resources to look at after this call. But I'm going to give you just a very brief overview of the three alternative methods we can use here to do it correct, and give you the intuition about that for hopefully to do it correct. So this is kind of the same input, right? You recognize the 10,000 to 4,000 here, and the 400 to 800 number of clients and the interest rate. So we're starting off with exactly the same inputs as the wrong model, and we do it correct here. So what are the three approaches? Giving you very quickly an overview of them. The first one is called the compound function and at risk. So that's actually the reason why the compound function came in existence, I guess, or why this is such a useful function. It's because we can prevent this mistake, and so let's get some intuition behind that in a minute. The second one is called something called central limit theory. I'm not going to go through that in a lot of detail. I will certainly also refer you to some pages in Model SIST, as I did at the beginning, but I'll just want to point out that that's also an approach, and we're actually going to see in a slide that it will give exactly the same results. So the good news, of course, and this is what you would expect about correct approach, is that all of these three approaches will give you the same results. And then the third approach is called what we call the brute force approach, and you'll see in a minute why that is called the brute force approach. So keeping it short, so the compound function, basically, what you'll see here is that instead of multiplying it really, we put both of the, what we call the frequency and the severity distributions. And frequency is how many loans are we going to extend, so number of clients, and the severity, so the, how big is every loan, we're going to put them both into this thing called a risk compound distribution. And the first one is always the frequency. So you see here the frequency is somewhere between 400 and 800, and then the severity or the size of the loans in this specific example is your risk normal distribution or log normal distribution, what that means as standard deviation. What now at risk does in the background is basically if we, for example, come up with an iteration where it says, well, in this specific iteration, this potential future scenario, it's going to be 510, then behind in the background, it will actually conceptually take 510 samples from this log normal distribution and add them all up together. So in other words, every loan is going to be different. So loan 1 may be 6,000, loan 2 may be 8,000, loan 3 may be 20,000. And it's going to add them all up together. And so now we actually don't assume they're all the same. They're all having different sizes. Right, so that's the risk compound distribution. The brute force distribution is let me skip over for the moment the central limit theory. The brute force approach is actually, I think it's the most intuitive distribution, or the intuitive approach. And what you see here is that we did nothing more than just putting every of those clients and giving them a different log normal distribution, just like you would have thought about it, and like we explained it a minute ago, and every one of those gets a different distribution. I'll press the F9 key for a few times, and you see that in different simulation, different future scenarios, it gives different sizes. And then what we do is we say how many clients in this, because we're taking random numbers from that per distribution in this case. And so for this specific iteration, it says 693. So what we would need to do is we need to scroll down to 693. I scrolled a bit too fast here. And just to kind of show you, give you the intuition here. So 693. So what we basically do is this is the loan of client number 693. This is basically the total of every client up to client 693. So remember this 6934. If we scroll down all the way up here again, we use something called a VLOOKUP. That's basically looking up in that table client 693, and that's the number now that in this specific iteration, how much into total we are going to lend out. All right, so that's brute force approach. You see why we call it brute force, because you're actually having to use brute force to simulate every one of the clients. It will work, and it's very good when you don't have too many clients or don't have too many losses, for example, and we'll talk about some other example in a bit. It's going to be very hard when you have 10,000 clients, for example. Your spreadsheet is going to be very slow. Central limit theory, I'm going to take it, actually, I'm not going to go through it in a lot of detail, but what it basically does, it says that if you're adding up a whole bunch of distributions, which is what we're doing, right? We're adding up a distribution for the first client and the second client and third client. Then what central limit theorem says is that if you're adding many distributions together, the total is going to look like a normal distribution. That may surprise you, but that's what central limit theorem says, and it works. It's proven, etc. And the second thing is that it says something about the standard deviation, and it says actually that you see the square root of the number of clients in this normal distribution. So it says that basically the more clients we take, relatively the standard deviation is going to go down. And this is kind of the whole thing about why insurance works, right? Is that when you're adding enough distributions together, relatively the distribution gets narrower and narrower. Again, I'm not going to go have time, and we're already 20 minutes into it, so I'm not going to have a lot of time to go through this in detail, but you'll have all the formula and the data here as well. All right. So does this matter, you may ask yourself, right? So here we have the screenshot of all of this as well. Does this matter, you may say? Well, let's see, actually. So we actually simulated the 4 different approaches. So 4 meaning the incorrect approach and the 3 correct approaches. And, of course it matters, because otherwise we wouldn't have spent 10 minutes on this. But here you see how much it matters. So here you have the distribution, the purple one, where we made the mistake. And you see that there's actually, in that mistaken, the wrong approach, you see there's a lot of uncertainty, much more than in reality. And you see here the 3 correct approaches, they're all overlapping, that we're really overestimating the amount of risk if we incorrectly multiply distributions. All right. Now, again, we talked about you're probably not a banker, or you may not do exactly the same as we just talked about as an example, but let's talk about some other examples where this also came up and where we see this common mistake. So, for example, you are managing a services team, and you're trying to forecast how much demand is going to be on that services team. So, for example, they are going out to make certain repairs at clients. And some of these repairs may be an hour. Some of these repairs may be, 2 days of work to fix, to make sure the client is happy again. Your task is to understand how much demand, or how many hours, how much resources do I need to fulfill that demand. Now, you don't know yet how many calls are going to go in, and you don't know how big the sizes of all of these calls are going to be. And you can kind of see here the parallels to what we just talked about. You have an uncertainty how the frequency of the amount of calls and the length of each of these calls. And again, multiplying those 2 distributions together would have given you, first of all, it would be a mistake, but secondly, it would have greatly overestimated the amount of risk you really have. And this is, for example, something we did to try and optimize the hiring decisions of the company. But it was very important that we took the right approach. Credit and operational risks are very common areas where you see, we don't know how many operational risk events we're going to have, so that's an uncertainty, as well as how big is the size, for example, in dollars or in something else of these operational risk events. Having some other practical examples, you're maybe building a natural gas line, and you need 5 pumping stations in that. And every pumping station, is in a different location and may have some different cost to that. Just putting 5, multiply that by a distribution of the cost of each individual pumping station is, again, going to give you a mistake. We should really model every single pumping station separately with its own distribution and then adding them up together. So, the final one, and we're going to go into that in a lot of details, but we were engaged with a project where the amount of pig meat eaten by a family was very important. And some families eat a lot of pork, and some families may not eat a lot of pork. But if you now multiply that by the number of people in a country eating pork meat, then we certainly can't multiply that by a distribution that sometimes generates 2 ounces and sometimes generates 2 pounds, because not every family is going to eat 2 pounds. And you'll see, we go all the way from pig meat to bankers, and you see the amount of applications where this could be a problem. All right, and then finally a very quick one, and I'll leave this very short, but oil and gas is another example where we found that this is sometimes done incorrectly. So a large oil and gas company, what they wanted to do is look at the amount of production coming from several hundred wells, and also they looked at a distribution of how much well production there is from individual wells and multiplied it by kind of 100, for example. But in fact, every well has their own distribution and should be considered its own sample. So any of the 3 approaches would have helped. And so what we did is we used central limit theory and then used optimization to try and figure out actually as well how many wells or which exact wells should be drilled as well. So, but that just kind of give you some other examples of where this mistake happens. All right. So taking a little rest here, that was the hardest, or at least the most technical of all of the common mistakes. So the next one here is what we call software is no substitute for critical thinking. All right, so what does this mean? Well, in very general terms, again, what we see is that people, or some some people doing Monte Carlo rely too much on the software itself without critically thinking what that actually means. So, so give you an example of that. So you may have some historical data on returns, or some data, and what you could do is you could open up at risk and then click Fit a distribution to the data, and then automatically select the distribution that is the highest, what we call goodness of fit statistics. So some examples of these goodness of fit statistics are things like the Anderson-Darling statistic, or the Komotna-Smirnov, or information criteria. There's a bunch of these goodness of fit statistics out there that their goal really is to help you understand what distribution is the best fit. That's why they're called goodness of fit statistics. So the idea here, and the simple example why I bring this up, is that this is really letting you very much rely on just going for the best fitting distribution. We've seen that happen quite often, and it often, or it can really cause you some terrible distributions. And here you see an example, for example, where, and this is pretty clear, I think, that this distribution, you really have to think about this is the right one. This could be something like, how many people get infected by a disease, or something discrete, for example. If you just kind of use the software to decide what distribution to use, this could be, and in this very simple example, for example, the best fitting distribution. And what you see here is that this distribution, for example, goes below 0, right? Here you have the 0, and we certainly don't think that the number of people can't be really negative, right? Now this is an extreme example. I put this up just everyone can kind of follow this, but what is really important at the end of the day is that we don't really just kind of press the buttons in the software and kind of the software is dictating what we're doing, but that before we do that, think very critically about, okay, what do we know about our data? What has industry, for example, what kind of distributions make sense? And think very hard before we press the fit distribution to data, that we may actually, what we would advocate is that before you do that, you already think critically about, okay, I think these 3 distributions are just distribution that makes sense. So I'm just going to fit those 3 distributions to my data, and don't necessarily go for the best fitting one, because as I said, there's quite a few goodness of fit statistics out there. So which one are you going to use? That's one of the questions, of course, and depending on which one you use, you may actually get different distributions are the best fitting one. And so don't necessarily let the software dictate that. Think very critically about that before you do that. Another thing that I would say with specifically to distribution fitting itself is that it may often not be even justifiable to fit what we call parametric distribution to the data. You may actually have to think about using some empirical approach, meaning you really just kind of use the data, and there's some neat techniques about that, how you can fit empirical distributions to your data, in which case you don't really have to assume it's a log normal or a gamma distribution. You're just saying the data is the best representation of what is what I'm trying to model. So there's some nice techniques out there that are certainly worthwhile looking at, that you don't necessarily have to rely just on the software itself. All right, giving you some other examples here. Very closely related to fitting distributions to data, batch fitting distributions to data. Be very careful with that. Again, you just kind of what I mentioned in a moment ago about fitting distributions. Now we're actually fitting, say, 10 distributions to 10 different data sets, and we all do that with one click of a button. It's very hard then to test afterwards, like, what is really the right distribution to use, and do I even want to use parametric distributions? Does that even make sense? So be careful with those tools. I'm not necessarily saying, and I'm certainly not saying that you can't use those tools, but think critically before you use them. Another thing that we're going to talk about in just a minute is using rank order correlation, because it's the only correlation pattern that's explicitly included within at risk. So again, there's a place for rank order correlations to use, But there are a lot of alternative ways of putting in correlations in your model. Again, that's the subject matter of the next common mistake. But I put it here as one of those things that, because it's the one and only thing that's explicitly included in at risk to use for correlation, it doesn't need to be the only thing we use. So again, in a minute we get a lot more of that. The last one I want to point out is kind of as a another example is what we're talking here about is something called time series forecasting. And there's some really nice methods at risk now, such as the GARTs or other time series methods, geometry, Barnum motion, etc., that can help you forecast something over time, given you have some historical data. So this example, for example, we have 5 years of sales, and what we do here is we actually fit something called a GART model, and I'm not going to even pronounce the whole name here, you have it right in front of you, to that 5 years of sales. Now the reason I point this out is be careful. If you're not familiar with the GARTs, and a GARTs is a very complex time series model where there's volatility, there's actually changes in the volatility over time. Out of 5 years of sales data, putting a GARTs, kind of fitting a GARTs to that is probably a big overkill. And so be careful with that you don't, because it's in the software, in at risk, and it has specific good functions, but if you have 5 years of sales data, it probably isn't the right thing to fit a GARTs to that. GARTs is every distribution and every time series method has mathematics behind it, of course, and that mathematics typically tells you a story. I pointed out just a minute ago, GARTs assumes that there's volatility and that volatility changes over time, etc. And deducting that from 5 years of sales data is probably an overkill. All right. So enough said about that, but really kind of the main point here is that, be critical of what you're using and how you're using the software, and don't just use it because it's there. All right, so we're at common mistake number 3, value your relationships. Maybe a little breath here, just a little cup of tea here, sorry. Just a quick break. All right, so what is the mistake in general here? And what do we see very often that we'd like to point out to everyone here? So it's I guess a dual mistake somewhat. The first one that's really written here is forget or omit including relationship within your Monte Carlo model. I would point out, or I would at least say the second mistake is very related to this, that I just kind of pointed out a minute ago already, is that just using a rank order correlation as the only way of including a correlation in your model is also somewhat of a mistake. And I'll point to that in just the next slide again, and we'll talk actually about a couple of alternative methods, including relationship within your model. Now the underlying, I guess, rule that you see here in bold letters that I would want to point out, and that is really applicable to any model, of course, but relationships, it's really important as well. That is every iteration, so every Monte Carlo simulation you're doing, so for example, if you're doing 10,000 iterations, all of them has to be possible future scenarios. So in other words, if we look at some of these examples here, when we're trying to forecast an investment portfolio and the performance of that investment portfolio, and we have invested our cash or our money into, say, bonds and stocks and foreign stocks and real estate and commodities, etc. There's some relationships between, like, how the real estate market is going to do versus the bond market versus maybe the commodities market. And we, of course, need to take that into account when we're trying to forecast the overall investment portfolio. So this is really important, and I think it's pretty clear here that when you're forecasting an investment portfolio, this is really important. But you'll see this actually in many different applications. For example, where we're forecasting a new product, and we have an uncertain price and an uncertain demand. Now, if we increase the price and make it higher than maybe what we initially anticipated, then we probably will see also an effect on demand. So this is another kind of more of a hidden relationship. It's kind of a price elasticity kind of relationship, but it's very important, and we also take it into account when we're doing a financial risk analysis or a Monte Carlo of a new product. Or another good example is when we're evaluating the project cost and the schedule of building a pipeline, for example, to take an example we just talked about, or building some kind of plant we need to build. There's very often very close relationships between how the schedule goes and if we have any overtimes versus the cost, and they're often very, very interconnected. And so it's really important we take those into account. That's the first point. And the second point is that we know that there are more techniques than just the rank order correlation. There are techniques that we're going to see in the next slide. So here is a quick overview, and let me just kind of jump straight to the orange that you probably, your eye caught already. So as a general recommendation, and as a general rule, or recommendation is probably a better word, is that use rank order correlation. There certainly it has a place for sure, but very often, and we look at these different methods in just a bit, that we would guide you to use it if the other methods don't really work well. And so what are some of the other methods? So we have something called an envelope method, a lookup table, logical relationships, if statements, etc. They're all ways of including relationships and correlations, if you will, in our models. The bootstrap or regression models, they're all ways of including that if something goes up, something else tends to go up as well, or tends to go down, etc. And some of this is very logical. So I'll give you an example here. I don't know if some of you are in the area of pharmaceuticals, but I can all talk you through that if you do medical tests in, say, the development of a drug, and you're going through what you call a phase 3 trial, and you actually succeed in that trial, which is either not succeeding typically or succeeding, so you kind of have a distribution there, often called a binomial or Bernoulli distribution that has a 0 or 1. Then if you succeed in that trial, you will actually have sales and you will have cost of selling the product, etc. So this is a very logical relationship where an if statement or so, where we say if the binomial trial gives us a success for this phase, then we're going to launch the drug. That would be very good for a logical relationship like an if statement. We would never want to use a rank order in that case, of course, because a rank order correlation is a lot harder to understand than a very logical kind of if statement. So give you a bit of an overview of what these methods are. And I warned you before that we wouldn't have time, or I didn't warn you, but I guess I told you before that we wouldn't have time to go through all of those. But what we did is we made models of every one of those 4 methods, all the way from a conditional relationship to a lookup table. And we'll send those Excel at-risk models right after this call to every one of you, and so you can have a look at it. I want to point out, I guess, a couple of things. So the envelope method is a really great method if there's an important correlation or important relationship between 2 variables. So for example, this method is an example of where the interest rate is correlated with the market rate. Now you could say, I can also do that with a rank order correlation, which is, you put in somewhere between a -1 and a +1 rank order correlation, and maybe you say, well, interest rates tend to be very correlated with market rate, so I put in, say, a 0.8 correlation. If you have a lot of data, that's maybe something you can do. But sometimes, when you have this one-to-one correlation, you may not have a lot of data. So this envelope method is a nice way of not having to guess if it's a 0.8 or a 0.4 or a 0.9, but actually putting in kind of based on expert opinion as well, but much more logical questions about if the interest rate is 3%, what do you think the mortgage rate is going to be? Well, maybe somewhere between 6 and 10%. And so you it's a much more logical way of building up a relationship, and here you see kind of how that pattern would look like. It's a positive relationship. It goes from, left bottom to the upper top, and this is a much more kind of expert opinion approach, and that doesn't force you into guessing is it 0.5 or a 0.8 correlation. All right, the other methods I'm not going to talk in more about than just say that look into them and have them in your, I guess, toolbox, because again, it helps you build models that are A, better, but also B, a lot of these relationships are a lot easier to explain and easier to kind of interpret than, I guess, the rank order correlation, which will kind of tell you need to put 0.6 or 0.5. All right, I'm going to have to speed it up a little bit more here. So let's go about good practices. So what we often see, I guess, when people start building at-risk models is that the first thing people want to do is open up an Excel spreadsheet and start adding at-risk to the model. The problem with that, though, is that very often it doesn't get you to the right model. It may get you to a very complex model that doesn't need to be that complex, or it may actually, in a worst case situation even, it may get you to a model where it answers the wrong question. So what we're advocating here is that before you even open up your spreadsheet and open up your at-risk, sit down with the team, and what we do often is what we call a conceptual model or a blueprint. You see, in the next slide, you see a little bit more about that. But what it forces you and what it enables you in a more positive way, it enables you to go through the model and through the scope of what you're trying to model, and allows everyone to kind of give their ideas and construct a model that really does answer actually the question you're trying to answer. So it has a number of benefits, a couple of that I already pointed out, but it certainly actually, if I put it the last point here, it not only gets you a better model and often a model that that answers the right question, but it also often reduces the time you actually work on a model or more work on an at-risk kind of project. Because now, just like when you're building a model or building a house, when you've got that blueprint, once you have kind of agreed on how it should, what kind of the questions are, the scope, the data you can use, etc., it becomes a lot clearer how you build it, and it often greatly reduces the time to build a model. So this chart is an interesting one that I just want to point out a couple of things here very quickly. And here is, by the way, a very quick overview or an example of something that we worked on, a blueprint for a risk work plan or a budget model. And we kind of write the goal of the model, an overview of this model, and then some more technical things. But when you're thinking about the blueprint, you're not thinking a 20-page document. It's more like a 3-page kind of overview that everyone can read and kind of get their input in. And again, I talked about the benefits a minute ago. So why this blueprint? This graph is a nice one, and I point out a few more things. So the size of the model and the amount of detail. So the more detail we have, what happens? Well, in terms of time and effort here, this blue chart, that of course is going to go up. The more complex you make a model, and again, blueprints can help you reduce that complexity often, but you see often time and effort going up, complexity going up. People think often, this is a very complex model, it must be very accurate, the perceived accuracy. The actual accuracy, I would argue, actually often doesn't go up that much, and actually we've seen it also go down. When you put more detail in, sometimes there's some probabilistic reasons why accuracy could actually go down. But what's more concerning, and this is why I think Blueprint kind of points out why Blueprint is also beneficial, is that the transparency often goes down. And so when we think about these models being really there to help guide decision makers and give them more insights into risks and uncertainty, this is not necessarily a good thing. This is a bad thing, right? So what we need to find is somewhere of a balance between, we do want some accuracy, and there's certainly we do need some detailed models, but it doesn't necessarily mean that more detailed models are always better. And certainly when we keep in mind that idea that models are really there to help guide decision makers and give them more insight. All right, very quick case study here. A pharmaceutical company we work with, they also developed their own model with help of some folks, but the model was actually very complex. So a very complex, from a Monte Carlo perspective, a very realistic model. It was very, very well done, actually, from a pure Monte Carlo at-risk perspective. The problem, though, is that it was so kind of complex that for the users as well as for management, it became, first of all, unworkable for users and not transparent enough for management. So the solution, I guess, to that, where we help the client is really focus on what are the main questions that need to be answered, and then let's sit down with the users as well as management, both have a stake in this, of course, and come up with how this model should look like if it needs to be workable and transparent. And we built that model very close collaboration, and as a result, now they're actually using it for every single new product they're in the process of launching. So you have to kind of find the detail, and I would say a blueprint was a big component of this. All right, keep it very short here because we are slowly running out of time. We have a few more minutes here, but a very good practice is before you start running 10,000 iterations in your model, right? Make sure you look through, say, 10 or 20 iterations individually. Right, so remember that every iteration has to be a possible scenario, right? So when you're doing 10,000 iterations, every one of them should be possible future scenarios. You should be able to look at it and say, yes, I think this is possible. And often what we see is people build their model and then press go, run 10,000 iterations, and they never take the time to actually sit and look at, pressing the F9 button, look at 10 individual scenarios and say, does this make sense? And I would strongly encourage you to do that very simple thing before you run 10,000 iterations. Just run 10 and look at every scenario, every of those 10, and say, okay, this makes sense. This could happen with this project, or this could happen with this cash flow, for example. And you'll very often find that maybe there's some little mistake you made, and now you have a negative sales or some relationship you forgot. So be critical there. I'm going to. Yeah, so this F9, I would say do that for sure. F9 gets you a single iteration. Document your models. I would say this is not the case, of course, for small models, but certainly when you have a model that is going to be used maybe more than once or twice, do a little bit of documentation, and it will pay off. It does take you a day maybe to put together, but it's a very good practice that shouldn't be ignored. All right, finally, and I've referred to this a few times already, so I can make it fairly short. But what I would say is that if we build models that follow all our good practices, that don't make any common mistakes, but at the end of the day, there's no understanding and maybe no trust in a model, then at the end of the day, even though it's all correct, the risk analysis is still useless. Because if it doesn't support management, and if management doesn't get it and give them additional insight, which is the overall goal of what we're doing here, then it was useless. So from that perspective, involve management. Involve them in framing decision question. We talked about blueprint. Let them look at alternative action, look at possible source of data. Let them be part of, even not at the final presentation stage, but very early on, so that you can be sure, or more sure, that at least your model is answering the right question and using the right assumptions that agree with management. I would say from presenting results, keeping it also very short from a time perspective here, but presenting results, don't be very selective here with the type of results you're presenting. What I mean with that is there are a lot of statistics that come out of an at-risk analysis. It doesn't mean that a lot of these statistics, like for example, how many iterations did you run, that's really not useful for management to know. As long as they understand you've done enough, then that's sufficient. And so there's a whole lot of statistics that that are not going to improve management insight. And so be very selective of what you present. And then finally, I think at the end of the day, we tend to focus a lot on the model, certainly when we talk about management, but think of, I guess, encourage management to, the model is a tool to help you think through problems in probabilistic terms. And so at the end of the day, that's really kind of the way we need to communicate with management, is help them start communicating, asking the right questions, not asking what is the NPV, but what is the probability, for example, that this is a profitable project, or what are the main risk drivers. So help them ask the right question, and I think we're doing ourselves a big service if we start educating management to start talking and asking questions in probabilistic terms, so that the models we make are giving the insight and helping the communication and really actually making a big difference. So I know that the last part of the presentation was a bit short, or at least a bit hurried. I hope that still covered most of it. As I said, I will share all of the PowerPoint as well as the models after the presentation. And if there are any questions, I think this is probably the time, Jameson.
Well, Hubert, thank you so much. This was really interesting. I'm so glad to have been able to see this. I know it was a big hit in Las Vegas, so thank you again for doing this.
You're very welcome.
Yes, we do have one. We have a question that came in through the question panel instead of the chat panel, but I can't see that. But if you wanted to ask that again in the chat panel, I can read that off for everybody, and everybody can hear that. Or we can wait just a second, maybe it'll appear. Anybody else have any questions? Wait a second. So far we just have rave reviews, so thank you.
That's great. And again, I would also encourage, if there are any more questions after the seminar as well, Jameson and I will make sure that those questions do get answered, either kind of when we send out the PowerPoint and the models, or afterwards. And if they're general enough, we will share all those questions and answers, of course, with the whole group. If not, then we'll answer those one-to-one, of course. So I appreciate everyone's attention, and it was a pleasure to do this presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much. We may have two questions in what is in a field that only you can see. It's a question mark icon. I wonder if that, Hubert, if you hit that question mark icon on your side, what you see.
I see a chat here.
But I'm not sure. Let me see. Well, maybe what I'll do, I'll see if I can jump to that. Let's see what happens if I do this.
Great.
And we will attend to that. We're almost there. I found it. Actually, it was a few more rave reviews.
Great.
And let's, almost there. Let's see what we have here. Second. Sorry about that, everybody. Is there any way you could provide any extra tips about using distribution fitting? We'd like to use this to help counter limited data availability.
So in terms of distribution fitting, it's a great question. So I think it's just to generalize that. So let's say you have limited data, talking, for example, 5 or 10 data points. How do you select what distribution to use, right? So I think there are a couple of methods. I guess the first one is if that is data that is from, I guess, representing something that tends to come, like I'm just taking an example here. When you're in the oil and gas industry and you're looking at the production of a well, something we talked about previously in the call as well, it's a pretty well-known, I guess, fact or practice to use a log normal distribution for that. That represent really how much production we tend to get from a well. In those specific cases, when you even have 10 or 20 data points, you can use, even though it may not be the best fitting distribution, you can use something called a log normal distribution to represent that. And so that's what we call a parametric distribution fit. Where you kind of know where it comes from. You've seen that in a lot of cases already. In that case, it's not a bad thing, or there's good evidence that that's a good distribution. The one thing I would say with that is, so we typically look at an example. For example, when you have, you look maybe at 10 people and their height, and say that's something we want to fit a distribution to. The problem with when you have that few data points, right, 10 or 20 or something, is that, for example, if we just look at the average of those 10 people, right, and we want to fit a distribution to that, say that we fit a normal distribution to that the mean of that, of those 10 people, right, would then be the mean of that fitted distribution. Say that is, 6 foot, for example, for some reason, it's tall people in this case. What we're trying to do actually is not really understand the mean of the 10 people, but we're trying to have a distribution that now represents, for example, in a certain population or, say in a certain country, what the mean and the standard deviation and so is. When we have that few data points, the mean by itself is actually uncertain as well, right? So we don't just have a distribution, say a normal distribution or a log normal distribution that says, the mean is 6 and there's a standard deviation of a foot, for example, but actually the 6 is also uncertain and even the standard deviation is uncertain. What we call that is something called second order distribution fitting, where the parameters of the distribution itself are uncertain. So hopefully you kind of all follow that, if we just fit a distribution to the 10 people with the mean and the standard deviation, for example, the normal distribution, then the actual parameters of the distribution are uncertain itself as well. So there we would, when you have that little data, and we have 1,000 data points, that isn't so relevant anymore. But when you have that little data points, that becomes actually pretty important. So that is what parametric distribution fitting. So when we try and fit, using at risk, there's also a technique that I would also consider, and it really kind of depends on the data you're trying to fit. But when you use something called a non-parametric distribution, and what I'll do is, if given that this came up in the presentation as well, and this was a good follow-up question, is I'll actually send out another model that I haven't actually shown in the PowerPoint presentation, the WebEx here as well, but that will show you, I guess, the 3 or 4 different ways that we just talked about. So parametric, like the log normal distribution, but also a non-parametric approach, because we can also do that with that risk, and therefore in that situation we don't really have to make an assumption about is it a log normal or a normal distribution, but we can just use basically the data that we have without having to make that assumption. So I'll promise to send that out in a follow-up email as well.
And we do have a number of other distribution questions, but I think we can handle those in an email too. That would be great. And
great.
We probably should let you go shortly. And yeah, we do have some good distribution questions here. But
great.
That's be the nature of our questions, so perhaps some of them will be answered in our communication back and forth with our new community that we've had with this webcast. And probably sometime this afternoon I'll send out the follow-up, and we'll have a link to the recording also. And again, it seems like people got a lot out of this, Hubert, so thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you all for being here, and Jameson, thank you very much for organizing.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed the flight.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody. And once again, you'll be hearing from us shortly.